Before we move on to displaying our newly created pins on the page, I want you to note something about how we executed our create pin mutation from our create pin component. When we submitted our pin content, note the fact that when we provided all of the pin information, we had to create a new GraphQL client. Remember that we previously had to do that within our login component in onSuccess. And while this is acceptable, it works fine, we can do better in terms of reducing the code duplication. And instead of every time we need to execute a query or a mutation in a component, create a new GraphQL client, we can instead create a utility that will allow us to reuse the very same client. And the way that we're going to do that, to reuse the same GraphQL client, is by creating a reusable hook that our different components can hook into when they want to execute a query or a mutation. So we're going to create this reusable hook in our source folder. So we'll create it on the same level as index and reducer and context. And we're going to call this client. This will be our GraphQL client. And the first thing that we'll need to import is GraphQL client from GraphQL request. And we want to call our new hook use client. So we're going to export from this file our hook use client. And it's just going to be a function. And remember that when we created our client, it needed a couple of things to get set up. It needed a URL, an endpoint, and it also needed our ID token to set the authorization header. So we're going to create a piece of state within this hook for our ID token. So we'll import up at the top of client use state from React. So we'll use some state, and our token's initially going to be an empty string. So we'll declare an ID token variable, and the setter will be set ID token. And note that after logging in, after our user's logged in, within our create pin component, in order to get the ID token, we had to grab it from the window. And we had to use this really long path of methods and properties in order to get access to it. So this is a perfect use for a hook in the sense that we can use the useEffect hook in combination with useState to first of all wait for the window object to be there, and it's going to be there when our component mounts. So we can use some state and then update it with useEffect and provide the effect function, wait for the component to mount, or execute rather this when our component mounts by adding a second argument of a set of brackets, an array, an empty array. And within useEffect, provide the way to get that ID token. So we'll just copy that from create pin, and we're going to put it in a variable called token. So when we have our token, we can set our ID token, pass in our token variable, and then from this custom hook, we can just return a created client. Now in order to get our endpoint, we'll create a variable called base URL or endpoint, for example. And we want to provide a conditional here that's going to allow us to easily add a URL for production. So we can use an environment variable within our React app called node.env. We get that from process.env.node.env. And if node.env is set to production, then we want to use a production URL. So this would be maybe a custom domain name or a Heroku URL or something like that if we deploy to Heroku. But for now, we're not in production, we're still in development, so we'll just provide a dummy value of production URL, or maybe insert production URL. Otherwise, we're going to include what we've previously had, localhost 4000/GraphQL. And we can also export this as well. This will cut down on our code reuse. We can provide this to our login component, for example. And then at the very end of our use client hook, we can return a new GraphQL client, which accepts our base URL variable, and then we'll set the headers where authorization will be our ID token in state. So I'm going to begin by first going back to login and replacing localhost 4000/GraphQL with our base URL variable, and we'll make sure to import that. We'll import base URL from ///client. So this will make it very easy when we have a production URL. And then to use our use client hook, we can head to create pin. Up at the top, we'll import use client, and we're exporting it with export const. So we'll bring it in between a set of curly braces, use client from ///client. Just like we've added every other hook, we need to execute use client up at the top of our component, and it's going to return to us our instantiated GraphQL client. Then we can head down to handle submit where we're using it and remove the ID token variable, remove the client variable, and now we're just hooking into the client, and we can save all of these files and try creating a new pin. We'll open up our console, and also note that we can remove our GraphQL client import from GraphQL request within create pin. So once we've done that, let's find a new location on the map, create a pin, and when we hit submit, our pin should still be created successfully.